Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. This is a great event. We have Colin Mayer from Oxford University visiting us, and we thought it'd be a great place to showcase his book. And Ron Gilson knows him for many years, and he's going to do the introduction of Colin Mayer. And Dave Larker, who's one of our senior faculty at the Rock Center, will make some comments. So I think this is going to be a great discussion on the nature of the corporation. It's a great book. I encourage everybody who's interested in the topic to read it, and it's a very interesting angle to the discussion. So we're very happy to have you here, Colin. Thank you. And later, when we're going to have discussions, please go to the microphones. It's going to be videotaped, the event. So we're going to post it later on the website. So thank you for coming again.
Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome Colin to the law school and the Rock Center. Evan is right. I've known Colin for longer than I want to acknowledge. Colin has a remarkable career, and I'm very careful about that because I wanted to be careful not to use the phrase that's normally used in introduction. Someone has had a wonderful career. It's an introduction, not an obituary. Colin is a prolific and creative scholar. He's the founder of one of Europe's leading business consultant firms. As educational entrepreneurs go, it's hard to have a better claim. He was the first professor at the Said School of Business at Oxford. Later, it's dean. And dear to the law school's heart, Colin has been the driving force behind Oxford's Law and Finance program, which, in my assessment, is by far the best effort any place to actually move the two disciplines together. But so we're here tonight, though, not to learn about what Colin has done, but to hear what he has to say about the economic governance of corporations, a form of organization that the last 10 years have repeatedly reminded us, like it or not, that they are central to all of our economic well-being. There's a pattern to Colin's scholarship that explains, I think, why we were all very smart to come tonight. My own experience is that I don't learn very much when I listen to people who see the world the same way that I do. Colin's work has that wonderful characteristic of a kaleidoscope. He looks at what we look, and he just turns the dial a little bit, and suddenly what we see, whether or not we end up agreeing with it, what we see are things that our way of looking, our habits of looking at things, that view masks. So during the 1890s and 1990s and 1980s, he's not that old, when standard scholarship in finance and in law has championed the notion of just let the capital market run. Colin's work reminded us that inside finance had an important role to play, and we couldn't understand one without understanding the other. When academics and the leading financial NGOs decided that legal rules, particularly the difference between civil law and common law, made all the difference in the world, and we could explain important variables like the distribution of stock ownership just by deciding who liked Roman law and who didn't, Colin's work looked at history and basically demonstrated that it was really the other way around. You got distributed ownership before you got shareholder protection, but shareholder protection was, in fact, derivative of the initial distribution. Colin's book both champions and castigates the corporation as an economic and social actor. More important, he provides really bold suggestions about how to improve its performance along both dimensions. Whether or not we ultimately agree with his diagnosis and prescription, when we see the world through his kaleidoscope, we're going to end up changing our own views, even if we don't agree with his.
Ron, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words, and Thank you very much for inviting me to be here tonight, and thank you to the Rock Centre, and thank you to Evan Epstein for having set it up. It's a really great pleasure to be here this evening. I'm going to be talking to you about the most important institution in our lives. I'm not talking about religion, the state, Stanford University, or Oxford University. I'm talking about an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us, and invests our savings. It's the source of the United States' economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. It's a remarkably neglected institution because at the same time as it's achieved all that, it's also been the source of deprivation, poverty, and environmental degradation. And the problems are getting worse. Over the last few years alone, we've had the accounting scandals, market manipulation, the libel scandal, tax avoidance, the financial crisis, the payments protection mis-selling in the United Kingdom, mortgage mis-selling over here. We've had the Gulf of Mexico, environmental disasters, and the Fukushima disaster. And each of these is regarded as having its own particular cause, and each requires a specific solution. I'm going to suggest that they don't have a particular cause and they don't require a specific solution. There's a common problem and there's a common required solution. The common problem is the corporation, and the solution is to fix it and not everything else around it. Underlying the corporation is an economic concept of a production function that takes inputs of labor, capital, material, land, and converts them into goods and services. Or it's a legal nexus of contracts binding together the various parties to the firm. Or it's a social construct for reducing the costs of transacting in the market relative to the costs of transacting in the firm. And above all, the corporation exists to serve the interests of one particular group, and that is the owners, the shareholders. And the directors owe the shareholders a fiduciary responsibility to uphold their interests and to maximize the value of the corporation. And in so doing, it promotes economic efficiency, and by taking account of its reputation, it also promotes the interests of a broader segment of society as well. But when it fails to do that, then we seek to regulate it, and if necessary, we take it into public ownership. And where the corporation fails more, then we regulate it more or we nationalize it more. And when the state fails more, then we liberalize and privatize more. And that notion of shareholder-oriented corporations, regulation, and state ownership is a widely accepted consensus. It's the economic basis of national policies and international policies around the world. But I would suggest to you it is fundamentally wrong. The reason it's wrong is that the concept of the corporation that I've just described is wrong. It's not simply a production function or a nexus of contracts or a transaction cost reducing device. And above all, it does not exist, first and foremost, to further the interests of its shareholders. It exists to do things, to make things, to produce goods and services that benefit us as consumers and communities. And the corporation is exceptionally well placed to do this because it can balance the control that it exercises over various parties together with the commitment that it provides to those parties. And what allows it to do that is the feature of the separation of the ownership and control of the corporation. That, which in conventional terms is regarded as being a deficiency of the corporation, is in this context an attribute. It allows the corporation to provide a balance between control and commitment. It is an institution that is like us, but not of us. It can contract and be contracted, employ and be employed, sue and be sued, just like us. But it can also achieve much more because it can credibly provide the sorts of commitments that we are unable to do. It is essentially an Alice in Wonderland, but over time it has become a Frankenstein in Transylvania. And the reason for that is it's become captured by one particular interest group, and that is its shareholders. Not just its shareholders, a particular group of shareholders, very short-term shareholders. 70 years ago, the average holding period of shares on the stock market was 8 years. 30 years ago, it was 4 years. Now, it's a matter of months, weeks, days, hours, seconds, or in the case of high-frequency trading, nanoseconds. It wasn't always like that. The corporation was established with a public purpose by royal charter to undertake voyages of discovery around the world and open up merchant trading. And then several centuries later, it was established to build railroads and canals. And then with freedom of incorporation, it became owned by families. But those families then faced a problem. How could they fund their expansion? Initially, they did so by going to banks. But then increasingly, they turned to stock markets, and they issued shares on those stock markets. And in the process of issuing those shares, the ownership of the families became diluted. And it became diluted to a point where they lost control of the corporations. And initially, those shares were held by individuals that held them for long periods of time. And then, increasingly, by institutions like pension funds and life insurance companies, which, as I described, initially held those shares for long periods, but then increasingly for short periods. And the consequences of this have been quite devastating for our economic systems, our financial systems, and our environmental systems. Because in the pursuit of shareholder gains, these corporations have been willing to sacrifice the interests of other parties, the interests of us as customers, the interests of us as employees, the interests of us as promoting markets, and the interests of us as nations, as illustrated by the tax avoidance, and the interest, above all, of our descendants. And what has made this problem even worse is that the underlying notion of the problem has been misdiagnosed, and as a consequence, the appropriate remedies have been misstated. Because what is regarded as being the fundamental problem arising from this increasing dispersion of ownership is the conventional view of an agency problem. A problem that no one shareholder has sufficient interest or incentive to oversee and monitor the control of the corporations below them. So the management of those corporations are able to run riot. They pay themselves, according to this view, egregious salaries. They engage in wasteful investment and disastrous acquisitions. And nearly all public policy towards the corporation, in particular in North America and in Europe, has been devoted towards addressing this one issue of the agency problem. Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank in this country, the Cadbury Code in the United Kingdom, the European Commission, action plans on company law and corporate governance. All of them have one key objective in mind, and that is to address the agency problem. But actually, the agency problem, the separation of ownership and control, was not the cause of the financial crisis. On the contrary, those banks that had the highest powered incentives in terms of the closest relationship between the remuneration of their executives and shareholder returns were the ones that took the greatest risk. And those which had the best corporate governance according to conventional measures were the ones that failed the most. The underlying problem of the financial crisis was not an agency problem. It was essentially a problem of fraud. I don't mean fraud in the simple sense of what one attributes with Bernie Madoff. I mean something much more subtle. The sort of thing that we teach our students to do all of the time. To make money. There are two ways of making money. The first way is by making good or producing goods, what one might term wealth creation. The second is what one might term wealth transfer, by which I mean making money at the expense of others. That is what the financial crisis was about, because there is an inherent conflict between the two main parties involved in financial institutions. On the one hand, there are the shareholders who benefit from the upside gains when financial institutions do very well, and on the other side are the creditors who take the losses when those financial institutions do so badly that they fail and go bankrupt. From the point of view of shareholders, it's heads I win, tails you lose. And for that reason, shareholders like to flip the coin, and they incentivize their management to flip the coin and engage in excessive risk-taking, at least from the point of view of creditors. And that's why, as incentives of management were made more high-powered and corporate governance improved, performance apparently got worse. And it's not just in relation to financial institutions and creditors that this problem arises. Any party that makes a firm-specific investment, as it's termed, such as employees in investing their human capital, or suppliers in investing capital that's specific to their purchases, are exposed to the failures of those institutions. And it's not just in relation to excessive risk-taking that this problem arises. It also arises in terms of an underinvestment in activities that benefit parties other than the shareholders. An underinvestment, for example, in education and training of employees, and an underinvestment in environmental protection. And in particular, there is an investment problem that arises in relation to the different generations of investors in corporations. In 1920, Charles Ponzi invented a scheme by which he could make money for the benefit of his investors. It involved paying returns to investors on the basis of capital that he raised from subsequent rounds of subscribers. It is, of course, a chain letter or a pyramid scheme, and it's the basis of most fraudulent activities. But it's also the basis of much trading that goes on financial markets. Essentially, what it involves doing is taking risks that have a small probability of yielding large losses against large probabilities of small gains. And provided that those large probabilities of small gains go on happening for a sufficiently long time before that small probability of a large loss occurs, then those who create these schemes can make large amounts of money. And in my book, I describe just such a scheme based on a proposal from two economists, Peyton Young and Dean Foster, by which you can basically, within 5 years, assure yourself that you will earn enough to buy a country mansion. Now, what each of these does is essentially to create a risk of a substantial loss in the future beneath the assets that are created on the basis of the large probabilities of small returns. Now, these problems could be avoided if enough capital was put aside to ensure that those who lost could be adequately compensated. But what is critically important in this is not just the amount of capital, but also the length of time for which that capital is committed. And that is where a problem arises, because there is an incentive on those devising such schemes essentially to exit before the consequences of those outcomes are realized and the large loss comes to fruition. Now, what I'm emphasizing is that the conventional view of the corporation is that there is one problem associated with it which needs to be fixed, and that is the agency problem. But what I'm pointing out is there are at least 3 problems. There's a problem of agency, there's a problem of wealth transfer between different parties to the firm, and there's an intergenerational problem between different generations of investors, short-term investors, long-term investors, investors today, investors in the future. And the problem is that as one does something to solve one of those problems, one inherently makes the other problems worse, so that the more that you do to try and address the agency problem, the more you potentially create conflicts between other stakeholders and shareholders, the more that you do to reward current employees or current shareholders, the more you undermine the position of future generations. So the corporation is a much more complex vehicle, a much more complex vehicle to solve than the straightforward agency view of the corporation would lead us to believe. And that means that it's quite likely that the structures that are required to solve these problems are going to be more subtle than is generally regarded as being the case. Now, you might think that this is solved by corporations being concerned about their reputations. And I suggested at the beginning that reputations might help to align interests with society more generally. But I'm afraid if you think that's the case, then you're probably wrong. It was Wednesday, July the 27th of last year, at 1:30 p.m., up on the ticker tapes of the London Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange, flashed the announcement that Barclays Bank had been found guilty of the LIBOR scandal by the US and UK regulatory authorities. It was fined £290 million for that. Between 1:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. that day, when the stock market in London closed, Barclays Bank's share price rose. The stock market was overjoyed to hear that Barclays Bank had been found guilty of the LIBOR scandal. Now, you might say, well, that's a blip, and clearly, over the longer term, the share price of Barclays Bank actually declined. Well, I can tell you, in the 6 months between August and February, after that event occurred, Barclays Bank had a torrid time. Not only was it found guilty of the LIBOR scandal, it was found guilty of payments protection mis-selling and a number of other misdemeanors. And it had to set aside over £2 billion of provisions to pay compensation to those who'd lost as a consequence. Well, over that 6-month period, Barclays Bank share price rose by 60%, 60%, during a period in which the FTSE index rose by 10%, a 50% abnormal return. You might say, well, that's just Barclays Bank. Well, Lloyds Bank had to set aside around £6 billion of provisions for misdemeanors. Its share price also rose by 60%. And you might say, well, this is all just about financial institutions, and that's where the real problem lies, and it's got nothing really to do with other corporations in the economy. But exactly the same phenomenon are observed, for example, when companies are found to have violated environmental regulations. Their share prices either don't move or they go up. To the extent that there's a reputational impact that comes from the paymasters of corporations, their shareholders, then in relation to our interests in society, those reputational effects can be quite perverse. So what do we do about it? Well, we do one thing. We've got one instrument that we have available to control the corporation, and that is called regulation. And indeed, in response to the financial crisis, we have been tying knots around our financial institutions. So, for example, in the case of the UK, we are now going to ring-fence retail banking separately from investment banking. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer recently said this is going to be an electrified ring fence. And the European Commission recently said that the bonus payments that are going to be paid, that can be paid to bankers, are going to be capped in relation to their underlying salaries. We're going to be determining who runs banks, how much they're going to get paid, what they can do, and how much they can sell their services for. And what's going to be the effect of this? Well, the answer is that banks will stop doing things that are regulated, like lending money, which we might want them to do, and more of the things that are unregulated, like derivative selling, which we might not want them to do. They will do less in the form of formal banking and more in the form of shadow banking, which is unregulated. They will do less domestically, and they will do more overseas. And why is this happening? It's happening because the only way that we know of trying to instigate a sense of ethical conduct on the part of corporations is to regulate them. But far from making them more ethical, it makes them more instrumental. Companies and financial institutions have what they term compliance departments. Those compliance departments are, of course, really avoidance departments, as anyone who works in them knows. And the more that one regulates, the more that those compliance departments, which are supposed to produce ethical compliance, actually produce more instrumental avoidance. Now, there's one country in the world that illustrates these principles particularly well. It's a country that, by all accounts, is a model of corporate governance. It has well-developed financial systems. It has dispersed ownership. It has a very good rule of law, which is highly regarded. It has some of the best investor protection, not just of shareholders, but also of creditors of any country in the world. It has appointment of directors, which is subject to ratification by shareholders. It has increasing say on pay. It has an absolutely freely operating takeover market with no poison pills and no staggered boards. It requires that where acquisitions involve large transactions on the part of the acquiring companies, that those are subject to shareholder approval. It has a separation of chairman and chief executive. It has audit committees, remuneration committees, appointment committees, risk committees. It has every form of good corporate governance that you can imagine. It's called the United Kingdom. And it's been, from an industrial point of view, a disaster. It's been a disaster because 50 years ago, we had one of the best manufacturing industries in the world. We had one of the best electronics industries, engineering industries, chemical industries, and those have all gone to the point now that we basically have two large manufacturing companies left in Britain. Now, this has been variously attributed to things like too large a government sector, too much public ownership of corporations, too inflexible labor markets, too little mobility of labor, too much trade union control, inadequate competition policy. But those have all been addressed, particularly during the era of our recently deceased Prime Minister. But despite all that, the industrial decline of Britain has continued apace. And the real problem is none of those, but actually the impact of the financial markets on the behavior of UK corporations. Because of the dominance of shareholder interests, companies have been unable to invest adequately and take a sufficiently long-term perspective on the investment of their corporations. There's been underinvestment in physical capital, underinvestment in the education and training of its labor force, and underinvestment in both entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, the UK and the US are often categorized together as having similar types of financial systems, namely that they are categorized as dispersed ownership systems to contrast them with the concentrated ownership systems of many other countries in the world, with family ownership, cross-shareholdings, dominance by the state, dominance by banks. The UK and the US don't have that. But actually, the UK and the US are very different in terms of the nature of both their financial markets and their corporate systems. US, you can have, at least you used to be able to have, extensive takeover protection through poison pills and staggered boards. You could choose to incorporate in some states which were more management-friendly, or in states of the United States that were more shareholder-friendly. You could choose to have dual-class shares, as, for example, the founders of companies like LinkedIn and Google have chosen to do even once they become listed on stock markets. You can have, in other words, a degree of diversity of corporate ownership, corporate control, and board structures, which is far in excess of what is feasible in the United Kingdom. Basically, nearly all of these things are, for one reason or another, impossible to achieve in the UK. And I would suggest to you that that diversity has been a source of immense strength to the US economy, because that diversity allows corporations to choose the type of structures of ownership and control that are suited to the particular activities in which their corporations are engaged. It does not presume that there is a right way of doing business or a right form of ownership or governance of firms. And that has been a critically important element in allowing corporations to develop in a way in which it simply has not been feasible to happen in the UK. But that is currently under threat. It's under threat from basically a dogma which suggests that there is only one source of problem in the firm, and that is the agency problem, and that agency problem is addressed by increasing the degree of shareholder control over the corporation. So, for example, the pressures that are being applied to Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Dell, are basically designed to increase the degree of accountability of management to shareholders. That is not to say that there is not an agency problem or that there are issues that do not need to be addressed in relation to the running of corporations. But it is suggesting that a naive pursuit of shareholder supremacy can be extremely damaging for an economy. So what should one do about it? Well, the first thing that I think one should do about it is to celebrate the diversity of corporate governance, corporate ownership, corporate form that exists in the United States, not try to extinguish it. And indeed, one might try to go further in terms of not only recognizing the benefits of what exists at present, but to actually further that variety and diversity. And one element that I think one can seriously try to address is the nature of ownership and in particular, the extent to which there is long-term as against short-term ownership of corporations. It used to be the case that the voting rights in corporations were allocated on the basis of one person, one vote. But then it was realized that, of course, that isn't a very fair way of allocating voting rights, because people who hold lots of shares in companies and invest a lot in companies are essentially committing a lot more capital than those who only hold one share or a few shares in companies. So the voting pattern shifted from being one person, one vote to one share, one vote. And one share, one vote is a fundamental principle of company law. It's regarded as being the basis of fairness of treatment of shareholders. But of course, it's not fair at all, because a shareholder who invests for 10 years is in a very different position from someone who invests for a matter of seconds or nanoseconds. The degree of commitment of the former is orders of magnitude greater than the latter. And yet, there's no way in which one reflects that disparity. Indeed, on the contrary, at present, there's no way in which you can even register for how long you are willing to hold shares in a company. So what one might think of doing, if one's trying to increase diversity, is perhaps to think of ways in which people could register the period for which they wish to hold shares. But then, even if you can register that, there's no reward that you get from committing to invest for longer periods of time. On the contrary, all of the incentives are for those who sell their shares. They have liquidity benefits that if others commit, that they lose. So one needs to think about ways in which one might try to balance the incentives to be long-term as against short-term shareholders. And one might think about, therefore, for example, allocating more voting rights to those who commit to hold for long periods relative to those who hold for short periods. That is not to say that it isn't important to encourage those who are investing for short periods and who want liquidity from investing in corporations. They should not be discouraged. And indeed, they should be allowed to hold, for example, bearer shares, which they can freely trade on stock markets, with fewer or no voting rights attached to them. Now, ownership is one element of trying to think about increasing the degree of diversity, but it's not the only one. One can also think about extending the values of corporations beyond shareholder value. It is not the case that shareholder stock market listed companies need necessarily be preoccupied with shareholder interests. In a survey that was undertaken of middle management in the UK and the United States, France, Germany, and Japan, those middle managers were asked, do you believe that your company is run in the interests of just the shareholders or the stakeholders in your company more generally? In 70% of the UK and the US corporations, the middle management answered that their company was run just in the interests of their shareholders. In 20% of the French and German companies, they gave that answer, and in just 3% of the Japanese companies. Now, these differences matter. Those same middle management were asked the question, if your company gets into financial difficulty, would your company cut employment or cut their dividend? In 90% of the UK and the US corporations, they responded by saying that they thought that their company would cut employment. In the French and German companies, 40% of the middle management said that, and in the Japanese case, again, only 3%. These factors really matter, and it is not necessarily the case that a corporation needs to focus on shareholder interest, even if it's listed on a stock market. But at the end of the day, if it does have a broader set of values, someone needs to credibly be responsible for upholding those values and take responsibility if the corporation fails to do so. Corporate social responsibility has been a failure because that has not been a credible obligation on the part of corporations. I would suggest that the party that should be primarily responsible for upholding those values are the boards of companies. Some of the most successful corporations in the world are Bertelsmann, the media company, Carlsberg, the brewery company, Robert Bosch, the automotive components company, Tata, the engine conglomerate, IKEA, the furniture company. All of those have one thing in common. They are all owned by industrial foundations. Those foundations, in large part, distribute their profits to charities. But it's not really that philanthropic element that I want to emphasize. What I want to emphasize is the way in which the boards of those foundations operate. What those boards do is to oversee the operating companies below them, such as Carlsberg and Robert Bosch, and ensure that those corporations operate according to the principles and the values of the foundation. And if those operating companies fail to do that, then it is the responsibility of those boards for that failure. Now, this combination of long-term ownership, clearly articulated values, and a board that is responsible for upholding the values of the corporation can, I believe, create a greater degree of diversity than we currently have in corporate forms and a greater degree of trust in some types of corporations. But the important point that I want to emphasize is that while this structure might be suited to some corporations, it is not suited to all by any means. Because what is suited for small entrepreneurial companies is very different from large, well-established firms. What is suited to high-tech firms is very different from more traditional manufacturing companies. And what is suited to manufacturing companies is very different from service firms. And that is why the diversity of form that the US has until now been able to perpetuate is so important in terms of the economic success of both its corporations and its economy. Now, one can go further, not only in terms of having corporations that align interests of stakeholders more broadly speaking and balances long and short-term interests of different parties, but also in terms of thinking about aligning the interests of corporations more generally with society's interests. And one can do that through the tax system. Corporate tax is, within the conventional notion of shareholder-oriented corporations, a nonsense. It's a nonsense because within a shareholder notion, the corporation is just an appendage of its shareholders. And you might as well then tax the shareholders directly rather than the corporations. The only reason why we have persisted with corporation tax is that there was a belief, at least until recently, that it was a more effective, lower-cost way of collecting revenue from shareholders. But we now realize that far from being a more effective tax-collecting vehicle, it's a great tax avoidance vehicle. But within the context of what I'm talking about here, of corporations performing a wider role, there's a real function for corporate taxation, because it can encourage corporations to pursue not just investment in financial and material capital, but also investment in social capital, in human capital, in intellectual capital. And it can do so by subsidizing those that contribute to those forms of capital and taxing those that use or abuse those forms of capital. And the corporation is a particularly powerful vehicle for upholding the interests of perhaps the most important groups in society, and that is the unborn. Because unlike politicians that are elected for short periods of time, corporations have permanently invested capital, which it is hard for them to extract. And because of that permanently invested capital, it is in the interest of corporations to promote the well-being of future generations, because that future well-being of generations affects the future capital value of corporations and therefore affects the value of corporations today. And provided that there is an alignment in the control of corporations with that long-term capital investment, then the promotion of future generations is actually promoted, not undermined by corporations. And what I then discuss in the book is an agenda for addressing this issue. An agenda that's concerned with the ownership, the control, the regulation, and the taxation of corporations. And I suggest a 10-point plan that first of all says that corporations should take responsibility for their own conduct. They should not just simply go on doing things so long as they can until someone tells them to stop doing things. That the corporation should, in some cases, be controlled by long-term owners. Not in all cases, and as I'm saying, it's the diversity element that's the really critical point, but in some cases we have failed to provide enough in the way of long-term control of corporations. They should have clearly articulated values. In whose interest is the corporation being run? There should be a board of directors and an independent board of directors that is responsible for overseeing those values and ensuring that the corporation abides by those values. That where corporations violate public laws, such as bribery, corruption, market abuse, market manipulation, environmental abuse, then there should be much tougher enforcement of those regulations than we've had to date. Regulation should protect systems like our financial systems. But elsewhere, regulation should be less meddlesome and less intrusive. And instead, we should look to the tax system as a way of aligning the private interests of corporations with society more generally. And there's an urgent agenda to address these issues, which should start in places like this, law schools and business schools by teaching our students the purpose and values of corporations, so that when they go on to become leaders of corporations, they will understand their roles and responsibilities as well as their rights and rewards as executives and owners. Because underlying this is the notion that at the end of the day, the corporation should be a moral entity. The idea of having a moral commercial institution might sound like an oxymoron, but it's not a contradiction in terms, because the corporation is an exceptionally powerful vehicle for providing commitment. And the reason why it's so powerful is that separation of ownership and control, a separation that allows a corporation to balance commitments and control. And I want to end by illustrating that in relation to two institutions. The first is Barclays Bank, and the second is Lehman Brothers. Not the Barclays Bank and Lehman Brothers of today, but their 17th century and 19th century versions, respectively. Mayor Lehman, the founder of Lehman Brothers, would take his children every weekend to the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York to show them the plight of the worst off members of New York society. John Freed, the founder of Barclays Bank, wrote Scripture Instruction, a text that was used for more than 100 years in Quaker schools around the world. Those institutions that were founded with strong ethical principles by their founders have, over time, come to be owned and controlled by dispersed shareholders and executives who are interested in one issue and one issue alone, and that is making money. Re-establishing trust in corporations is, I believe, the most important issue of this decade, because without it, economic policies will go on failing, financial systems will go on collapsing, and the environment will continue to degrade. With it, we can create much greater levels of both economic prosperity and well-being than we have done to date. Because ultimately, a moral corporation is also a commercially successful corporation. And the competitiveness of nations depends on the moral fiber of its corporations. Thank
David?
Yes, thank you, Colin. It's a pleasure for me to provide some brief commentary on Colin's new provocative book, Firm Commitment. I'd like to first compliment Colin for some really careful thinking, but also thinking that's grounded in real research. And if you read his book, you'll see it's well footnoted and documented. And of course, Colin has an impeccable academic reputation, and you'd expect to see that in his book. And I contrast this with lots of governance discussions that I think are grounded in experiential, trust me, I think this is the right answer type of analysis. Colin's book is certainly not that. I suppose the central message of the book is while corporations have created lots of economic prosperity, the more recent output of the corporation is one of misery. And that's a pretty strong term, and certainly we've heard good examples of that. If true, Colin's book represents a strong call for careful thinking and collective action about the role of firms and the choice of governance. The Anglo-Saxon model is clearly shareholder as opposed to stakeholder focused. I guess in the more recent terms, the distinction is becoming more murky as we debate whether, does that mean it's board-centric or shareholder-centric. But regardless, my sense is, based on some research and some educated guess, is that the model has served society well over time, is likely to be good going forward in the future as well. Can the model be improved? The answer is almost certainly yes. And I guess the remaining question is, how do you do that in a sensible manner? Maybe the key question in Colin's book is, does the confluence of dispersed ownership, concentration of wealth, agency problems, executive compensation contracts, and the focus of shareholder values, it produced So the demon seed that is destroying Western society and rendering the traditional Anglo-Saxon model of business obsolete. I'd like to highlight three points that Colin talked about as hopefully will generate some discussion. First one is, are long-term shareholdings necessary for financial commitment to the firm? And that was a key part of the book. So the issue is, should more voting power, be given to shareholders that have held their shares for longer periods of time? This is so-called time-based shares. The answer to this, in my opinion, requires some conclusions about how you think stock prices are set. Do stock prices accurately reflect all the information about the long-term prospects of the company? Or are they set by traders with a very short investment horizon and are fixated on short-term results? And that's a tough research problem, and there's lots of opinions about that, but I would say not much research. If we can answer that question, it's going to tell us a lot about whether we need long-term shareholders to control corporations or not. Although firms seem to worry a lot about the composition of the shareholder base, to my knowledge, there's no rigorous research that this feature has any impact on the economic performance of the company, holding aside the role of activist shareholders. Secondly, how do markets, stock markets, credit markets, labor markets, how do they actually operate? If the corporation is primarily focused on shareholder value, does this imply that other stakeholders are disadvantaged? And Colin gives a pretty passionate example in the book about the potential wealth transfer from debt holders to shareholders that are the result of asymmetric risk, unexpected risk changes that cause the natural wealth transfer. And this is where I kind of disagree a little bit, but all these points are obviously open to debate, but all these contracts are repeated play interactions. You would expect that reputation is going to arise. If bad behavior is observed or expected, we'd expect a market mechanism to penalize firms by raising the cost of capital or lowering its stock price. And that's going to be a direct cost to shareholders. And implicitly, if the reputation mechanism works, we would expect to see some mitigation of the problems that Colin highlights. The issue is, and I think this is the unknown part, is there an absence of information sharing? Are there frictions that are extreme in the market that don't allow reputation to be a disciplining mechanism? And I think that's a topic that deserves some serious attention. But when there's always going to be economic losses when contracting parties have different objectives. The issue is, in kind of economic speak, is the second best contract is within some reasonable bounds relative to the first best contract. And the first best contract would be if everybody trusted everybody and everybody agreed and everybody got what they deserved. But maybe it's the case that the deadweight loss is not that high, and it kind of remains to be seen. But I'm not so sure that contracting in free markets ultimately results in high levels of misery, but I certainly agree with Colin. It's certainly worthy of study. Third, and this is more philosophical, what does it mean to have shared values across shareholders, employees, customers, and the community, the environment, society, et cetera? Who determines the joint objective function? At some point, you have to maximize or try to increase something. The relative weights across these objectives are going to be difficult to compute, and we know from a famous Nobel laureate who's still at Stanford that we know this is not going to be Pareto optimal. Somebody's going to be disadvantaged when we make these changes. Should the task be delegated to a benevolent regulator? If so, what are the implications for property rights that exist now? And there's going to be some redistribution, and I think it'll be serious. The questions get at the issue of how trust evolves among disparate parties. Can trust form the basis of a new paradigm of corporate governance? Depending upon how much of the hype you believe, the trust model is sort of implemented at Berkshire Hathaway and a few companies like that, but actually I'd say quite rare in the United States. Can this type of model be effectively replicated across corporations? Are ethics, trust, responsibility, are they really absent from today's corporation? I don't think so. Are there bad apples or there's some bad players out there? Of course. But as a practical matter across the entire economy, I don't think it's quite that bleak. So let me conclude with the question of whether the modern theory on incentives, ownership, control of publicly traded corporations is broken. Do we need a fundamental revamp of our thinking about corporate governance? I guess my answer is maybe. This is a debate that deserves real attention and serious research. However, I think you want to be very careful going down this path or opening up Pandora's box. The curse of unintended consequences can easily come to the forefront, and you can easily end up someplace that's worse than where you started. Colin's new book provides us with one roadmap to guide our collective thinking about these issues and the implications about the future of the corporation, and I guess implicitly the Anglo-Saxon model of governance. It was a pleasure for me to meet Colin tonight and read Colin's book. And hopefully the small commentary will provide the source of a little debate over dinner tonight. Thank you.
But it can also provide the source of a little debate now. Why don't you, since we're recording it,
which it gets a little bit blurry is the question of who's the shareholder. And it seems to be like a word used, but the shareholders are owning essentially diversified portfolios, and then they become kind of go down that path. And of course, and it's a little bit that distinctions that are being made between shareholders and lots of other stakeholders become a little blurry when you consider just that piece of it.
Okay, so the question that was being raised was this notion of, if you like, shareholders on one side and stakeholders on another becomes much more blurred if you take account of the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity amongst shareholders themselves, and there isn't just one notion of a shareholder. And I think that's a really important point, and it's basically one of the fundamental things that I'm arguing in the book, and that is it's not just an issue about stakeholders versus shareholders, which has featured prominently in much of the literature, but it is as much a debate about, within the class of shareholders, which particular shareholder group should one be emphasizing. And a lot of that debate to date has been in terms of minority shareholders, small shareholders versus majority shareholders, large shareholders. And that's one distinction that one can bring up. But to my mind, the distinction between short-term shareholders and long-term shareholders is potentially as equally a significant distinction. Or if one looks outside, in particular the UK and the US, between different types of shareholders, like families on the one hand and institutional shareholders on the other, or between, yes, exactly, or the degree of diversification of those shareholders. And that, to my mind, emphasizes still more the importance of not simply thinking in terms of a simple shareholder model, but thinking in terms of the corporation as having to balance together various interested parties, not just between stakeholders and shareholders, but also within the shareholder community as well. And the one that I'm particularly emphasizing, but I don't believe is by any means the only one, is between long and short-term shareholders. And if I could just then take the opportunity to thank David for his very insightful and helpful comments, and thank you very much indeed for taking the trouble to read the book. And basically underlying your comments is the notion that, well, first of all, the Anglo-American model of the corporation, the shareholder-centric model, is not broke, and so we shouldn't fix it. And the first point I'd make is that, as I was saying in the presentation, Anglo is not American, and American is not Anglo. And so I quite agree that the model that exists over here is not broke, but I think there's much more evidence
that the form that it's taken in the UK is close to being broke. And what I'm concerned about is what I see as a mounting pressure over here to move towards a model which many people uphold as being the nirvana of corporate governance, which is essentially the UK. And so I think one has to be, and it really comes to your question as well, one has to be quite clear what one means by a shareholder-centric model, because there isn't really one notion of that. And that then comes to your third comment about shared values as to who should determine those values, and isn't it going to be the case that there are going to be horrible trade-offs that are going to have to be made if one moves over to a different focus of the corporation? And the whole notion behind the book is to say, no, we don't want to make those choices. On the contrary, we want to have diversity. And the way in which I describe it in the book is in terms of corporations as islands. Islands of different principles and values, some of which would be what one might term traditional shareholder-centric corporations with a focus on perhaps short-term shareholder interests. Others would have more of a long-term shareholder interest. Some would emphasize employee interests more. And people choose which island they want to inhabit, whether or not they want to be employed by a particular type of firm or another type of firm, whether or not they want to trade with this one or that one. People could select. But in choosing which island you move on to, it's critically important that the nature of the game doesn't then shift overnight. And that comes to your point about, well, shouldn't this be reflected in the price at which credit is raised if it's a repeated game? And the answer is yes, provided that the corporation doesn't change the nature of the game halfway through and shift from being, as many financial institutions did, I believe, shift from being apparently safe forms of investment for depositors and other creditors to deciding to take substantially greater risks. That's not to say that corporations shouldn't be able to adapt, but there should be a process that if that adaptation takes place, there is an element of compensation that needs to be paid for those who've chosen to inhabit that island on one set of policies which are no longer applicable.
Two quick questions. First, listening to you, your mission, vision, and values seem to be very aligned with a movement in the United States referred to as conscious capitalism. It is headed by, it is being led by the president of Whole Foods. Are you aware of it? And how has your thinking been influenced by this? Secondly, number two, you don't mention NGOs or nonprofit organizations in your talk. Is there any reference to them? As I listen to you, I can think of direct parallels. The community is the stockholders in their situations. Would you care to comment briefly on that?
Yes, and indeed, I am very much aware of organizations like Conscious Capitalism, and someone from there has just asked to see me when I get back to the UK, and indeed I'm being increasingly, as you can imagine, approached by a variety of different interest groups. And I think that there are a lot of very interesting initiatives that are being promoted. For example, the development of the Benefit Corporation over here. There's the state of Washington has introduced the notion of a social purpose corporation as well as the Benefit Corporation. And all of those are actually doing what I'm talking about in terms of promoting diversity. If I'm thinking about legislative developments that I regard as being beneficial, it's in terms of providing enabling legislation that enables corporations to select a greater variety of forms, not prescriptive legislation. But for the most part, I don't regard legislation as being the critical element here.
In terms of the role of NGOs and other groups, my view is that there are certainly elements of, if you like, what one might term increased democratization of corporations that will happen in the future. And that we're seeing happening already through, in particular, a variety of social media forms of where communications between customers allows views to be expressed in a much more powerful and rapid form than has been the case today. It's those sorts of factors that I think will push it's one of the reasons why corporations will, I believe, have to adapt going forward. On the other hand, I think that the notion of some of these developments can give rise to potentially damaging outcomes as well. And that is that in exactly the same way as I think one has to be very careful to avoid excessive political interference in the corporation and the dead hand of regulation, because I believe it imposes too much homogeneity. I think that there is also a risk that you can have popular movements that essentially create similar types of too much homogeneity. So I think that there is some potential value from these movements, but there are also risks inherent in them as well.
Okay, hi. I just want to say that I quite agree with you in your introductory remarks when you said that corporations are a pretty important phenomenon in the last couple of decades. But I would perhaps kind of disagree with your framework, because you seem to say that currently we're experiencing these problems you have identified, the corporation's impact on the environment, consumers, and workers. I would sort of maybe present or maybe push for a different framework, because if you look at the history of sort of this market economy, or we can also call it the capitalist economy, these problems were endemic from the very earlier days. I mean, you're from the UK, and if you think about London at the height of the Industrial Revolution, there was incredible smog, incredible pollution. And you think about the women and children who are working in the mines for 16 hours a day, right? And you think about, if you want to talk about impact on consumers, you think about, what happened before we had the FDA in this country, before the progressive movement. There were like rats and cockroaches in canned food. So it seems to me that, yes, corporation is a unique form, but the problems you have talked about have been present with this economic system from the very earlier day. And what's happening in history is that, this system, to me, that's my view, of course, that the system has this constant energy to generate these crises, and then the rest of society will scramble together and have this, this kind of talk and write books and say, how are we going to do this, solve this? And I mean, sometimes we overall, I think, thank God that we kind of get these things in control, right? We had a monopoly period, and then we have anti-monopoly laws, and then we have when the stock market started, and then we had this spectacular fall, and then we started to introduce legislations about, okay, we're gonna regulate the market and whatnot. So I feel like, to me, I would say let's just put that aside. Let's talk about the solutions you propose, right? I'm very pessimistic because I kind of have a certain view about how this government works in this country and how it closely works with money. So it's really difficult for me to say how this kind of government is really going to regulate corporations and how this kind of political leadership is going to inspire us to put forth any value. As a young person, I look at our political leaders, our corporate leaders, business leaders. I don't feel like I want to go out there and do something ethical at all. Just basically, let's all play the game. Let's go for it. Go for the money. So, but even, let's say that your solution works. We pushed really hard. You convinced me. I do my share. How is this not going to be just another stage in this constant, economic system that will periodically generate this kind of crises? I don't want to live in this pattern. I mean, maybe I'm lucky I can be in this, the aftermath of a crisis where things get resolved for temporarily, but I know it's gonna come up again.
I was in a good mood before I heard that.
Yes, well, let me just very quickly say that, yes, of course it's the case that history is littered with precisely the types of problems that we're talking about today. But there are instances of where corporations have really taken a lead in terms of addressing such problems. And I'll give you one illustration from my home country, which I've been so derogatory about to date. And that is at the turn of the 19th century, there were a whole series of companies, Bourneville, Cadbury, Rickett, Coleman, Boots, Beecham, Fry's, Terry's, which led the way in terms of treatment of employees, what they were trying to do to improve the well-being of their customers, the way in which they housed, educated their employees. And what they did was essentially to influence the legislative process. They weren't responding to principles in society. In those cases, those were nearly all companies that were founded by Quakers. And what those companies illustrate, and I think many companies today illustrate, is the great feature of the corporation is that it isn't the government, that it isn't this monoform institution that determines how everyone has to behave. One can have experimentation. And in that respect, I'm slightly more optimistic, I hope, than you are, in terms of the potential for the corporation to have a positive influence. And that what I'm really trying to do in the book is to say, this view that in a sense you're expressing, that we're in a system that we can do nothing to break out of because it's inherently driven by pure financial concerns, and that there's a good reason why we have that system. The argument of the book is there is no good reason. The fundamental argument for the shareholder-oriented firm is that shareholders are in a fundamentally different position from other parties to the firm because they don't have contracts, whereas everyone else has got contracts, and therefore shareholders need to be protected through having fiduciary rights over their directors. That is, to my mind, fundamentally wrong, because contracts do not protect other parties, or do so in a very imperfect way. And really, the whole purpose of the book is to say, we've got to rethink the notion of the corporation away from that particular paradigm that was presented. And in the process of doing that, I believe that one can actually create the types of experimentation that I was talking about in relation to the Quaker Company.
We have time for one more.
5 minutes.
He's dangerous. We cannot thank you enough for coming here today and for never breathing as you spoke to us and delivering the incredible framing of what you did. And I just hope the reason you didn't have to breathe was because you've given it so many times that you've influenced many people around this globe. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Some of my question you've answered, but I'd love you to add one more chapter to your book, which is, given those ending 10 dictums, here's what you have to do, and that's the how do you do it. And in this country, we have elected people like Elizabeth Warren, although very recently, that give some of my colleagues and I a lot of hope for the degree to which she is going to say no and say clarify and say, yep, the regulations are there, but we're not implementing them. But as you see trends such as perhaps we can find a few more Elizabeth Warrens, and movements in this country to try to get money, private special interest money out of elections. I wish we looked like the British electoral process, even though, as you point out, that in the end isn't perfect. And when you point to social media, I agree there's a lot of potential there. The downside also is how many of us as shareholders really pay attention to what we're voting on in those proxies if we take the time to vote, et cetera. So I'd love you to comment on, given that you know how to solve it, or you know the things that should happen to solve it. Is there anything further you can add other than what you already have in the Q&A to how to implement that? Because I do see a lot of it as through legislation, except you're right, it becomes so burdening. And it's so long and so painful. We're trying to amend the Constitution to get rid of the effect of Citizens United, for instance. But on the other hand, we're also trying to elect more and more progressive senators who will put more progressive judges in position who will take care of it through the courts. Any further thoughts you have about what we can do to implement your fabulous plan? And we cannot thank you enough. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for those comments. I mean, the question about how has many dimensions to it, one of which is that the best way of convincing people of the merits of these types of proposals is to point to examples where these have clearly been a success. And that's why I spoke in the talk about companies that have adopted the types of approaches that I've been speaking about today, and done so not just in terms of having well-defined values, but also in terms of being highly commercially successful. And that, I think, is potentially a very powerful vehicle, not only as acting as role models, but also in terms of the competitive pressure on companies. Because as I was saying at the end, the notion that ethical corporations are commercially successful corporations is something that I believe has a lot of substance to it. And the reason why that follows is, and it comes back in part to what David was saying, is that if contracts are imperfect, the relations of trust are critically important in terms of the basis on which firms trade with other parties. So the terms on which they can employ people, the contribution that people make as employees, the terms on which they purchase from suppliers, and the prices at which they can sell commodities to customers are dependent on non-contractual as well as contractual elements of trust. And that if one establishes high elements of trust, that one therefore becomes a more commercially successful corporation. So what ultimately will push things in the direction that I'm talking about is not just simply a list of wishes, but the fact that the competitive process will drive many corporations in this direction. And I think one of the most interesting developments that is going on at present is not just that we have got increasing multinational corporations, but that we are having increasing competition between different types of corporations and systems around the world. And I'll give you one illustration of a system that people regarded as being completely hopeless, and that is state ownership. Now, it's actually served China quite well over the last 20 years. Will it go on serving it very well over the next 20 years? I doubt it, without some element of reform. But will China go towards an Anglo-American model? I think most unlikely. It's got a real focus on long-term ownership, and it's got a focus on having at least some element of public purpose as well as private purpose. What is likely to be the effect of competition between pure shareholder-oriented corporations and corporations that have very different structures going forward? I think the answer is it's unclear, but it's by no means certain that the shareholder model is going to dominate. And I think once that sort of competitive pressure begins to take place, then I think that you see a rapid shift in the conduct of corporations.
One quick one.
Try to make it short. Is this on? Okay. So my question was actually addressed in part by a previous questioner, which is how your model incorporates the legislature, because here it seems as though corporations effectively are the government now, actually. And you see this a lot with lobbying. The barriers have basically broken down. But in the interest of time, I'll just try to make one point, which is I heard two things that really bothered me quite a bit, and I don't know if others in the room share my opinion, but Professor Walker, you said you thought that effectively the system by and large was working with a few spots here and there, and Professor Meyer, you said that you didn't really want to go so far as to say that the shareholder model is broken, and I just fundamentally disagree with both of you. I think it is broken, and I think that by refusing to acknowledge that, you do all of us a great disservice, and especially people of my generation, because, as you pointed out, there are these intergenerational transfers, and we are stuck, in my case, with lots and lots of problems to address that we didn't create. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me close this. I said quietly, I get one close. No professor ever has a class where they don't send them off with homework. And so I want to just frame something I think after listening to this would be wonderful to think about. And I want to set two different stories, both of which are true. One is the one that Colin suggests, in which we see nearsighted corporations managing in the short run, destroying jobs and social fabric. The other is hyperoptic corporations who manage to stay doing the same thing for years when markets turn against them, and where General Motors over 25 years loses almost as many jobs as we've lost in the last couple. Both of these stories are right. It reflects a tension, in my view, between two ways of thinking about the world that has been with us since early Britain. There are those of us who think like Edmund Burke, and there are those of us who think like Schumpeter. The world is either changing, and we better move quickly, or the world could change a lot slower because there are other values. Both of those are right. And one of the things to think about, and one of the wonderful contributions Colin makes to the debate, is finally putting up a carefully reasoned, carefully documented other side, is that it highlights the tension. We have our problems. Japan, as Colin mentions, everybody understands that the company's not run for the shareholders, has been in a 20-year recession. Balancing those two, trying to figure out how we accomplish the points that Colin makes, at the same time creating a dynamic system that can respond to Schumpeter. That's really hard. And if we all go home trying to think about how to make that happen, we'll have really accomplished something tonight. Thank you all for coming, and for the Rock Center for sponsoring it.
Thank you.